that this is a kind of leap from the concrete to the abstract, because we have been so far living in a world of quantities, of statistics, of numbers, and suddenly we are asked to enter a world where numbers and quantities and weights are transcended. But I think that the idea, the resilience is not only about economy and related things, but it's also about ideas, about concepts, about attitudes and mentalities, and that must be why culture also has become a part of the post-deluge discussions. In a sense, it's also an extension of the discussion on ecology, because culture is also an aspect of the ecology. One could perhaps call it the ecology of the mind. And it is also about retrieving the lost cultural spaces. It is about retrieving the idea of the nation that we are perhaps fast losing, and even the idea of democracy, and redefining the secular in the contemporary context, and looking at literature and art as a site of resistance. There are specific papers on the Kerala situation, on Kerala's renaissance, on the condition of the Dalits, and there is another paper on gender coming up tomorrow and day after. So I'll confine myself to certain very basic things, because it's an approach paper. So certain basic, one could say, questions of certain concepts and approaches. And I've called this paper Towards a New Cultural Politics. I'm not going to read the whole paper. It's quite long. I'll read a few portions and maybe try to connect them in between. The first point I try to make is that culture is no more considered a mechanical appendix of economics, an extension of economics, or, generally there is this Marxist concept of culture as a superstructure built on the base, which is economics. Indeed, it is an undeniable reality, but we have been called upon to understand, at least after theoreticians like Althusser, that the role of culture in society and history, we are called upon to look at it afresh and recognize the relative autonomy of cultural realm as against the previous and mechanical interpretation of culture as a simple superstructure built on the economic base. I will not go into the whole history of this redefinition of culture and the complexification and the nuancing of the relationship between culture and economy. Many thinkers have contributed to that, like Theodore Adorno or Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci, who hinted at it by introducing the concepts of hegemony and consent and common sense, in the creation of all of which culture definitely plays a major role. I will not go again into the microphysics of culture and how it ultimately has an impact even on the economy and the way we think and we relate economy to our lives, and we remold our own lives. I would chiefly discuss, and of course very briefly, the idea of democracy and some of the ideas that seem to be trying to throttle the central concept of democracy today. The idea of nationalism, the need to redefine or have a second look at the idea of secularism, and also literature and resistance, as I said, as a site of resistance. I will not go into a very detailed discussion of these, because when we think of culture today, one is also forced to think of what I would like to call, and I have called elsewhere, to counterculture. Because talking about counterculture and counter hegemony is pointless in the absence of true democracy that has space for opposition and resistance. Um, to understand democracy, perhaps we need to detach it from the instruments of the state and see it as people's power. The way in which it was originally seen by Marx, even though in practice, well, some of it got distorted. It is not the people who resist the state, but a state that seeks to constrain, contain, and suppress the power of the people through its institutions. So, true democrats always speak of expanding the base of democracy, overcoming its constraints through popular action aimed at social justice, and going beyond its present limitations and curtailments of rights. So ultimately, what the state does is to try to reduce, and not only the state, but all the authoritarian and hegemonic forces they try to do, it is to reduce the spaces of what can be called people's politics. And by reducing these spaces of people's politics, and by and effacing what they think is intolerable, and yet the indispensable foundation of the political, means opening up another battlefield. It means witnessing the resurgence of a new radicalized figure who upholds the power of birth and kinship. And this is no longer the power of former monarchies and aristocrats, but that of the peoples of God. Like Rancière, for example, he takes the examples of radical Islam and the American evangelists fighting democracy in different ways. And in our context, I believe it can well be replaced by the apologists of what has often been called Hindutva. So, what we need to understand about democracy when we try to reshape our own democracy in Kerala and perhaps in the whole nation is to see that it is actually the action that constantly wrests the monopoly over public life from all kinds of oligarchic and hegemonic rules and ideas and communities, and the omnipotence over lives from the power of wealth. No institutional form can guarantee democracy unless it is forever active and can wrench its power from those who monopolize it for their private ends. This is where politics also begins. When it converts what was just a noise into language. When those men and women who don't have time for anything other than their work prove that they are indeed speaking beings participating in a shared world and not furious or suffering animals. I think one of the major things that happened during the deluge in Kerala was this emergence of people who were considered subhuman or who were invisible into visibility, and they are getting humanized. They are getting recognized as human beings who perhaps are better human beings than those who claimed that they were the real human beings, because they, as you know, like the fishermen, whom, well, the mainstream had very often ignored. They suddenly became the protagonists of rescue, of bringing life back to communities, and these are certain crucial moments in the process and the history of democracy, where the invisible becomes visible, where what was inaudible becomes audible, and what was just animal noise becomes human speech. So it is this marking of the presence of the human, of the real of the emergence of the invisible into the visible that ultimately defines democracy. And the challenge to Indian democracy, and of course now we can very well say about democracy in Kerala too, has always come from sections that hate democracy as an idea. And this hatred is deeply rooted in a contempt for the people with their diverse natures and aspirations, and manifests itself chiefly in four ways. One, intolerance towards our religious, philosophical, and cultural plurality. Two, silencing of popular and intellectual opposition, and a consequent thwarting of the freedom of expression. Three, the enfeeblement of the federal polity and the increasing centralization of power. And four, contempt towards those sections of the population whose welfare constitutes the very goal and measure of democracy. That is, women, peasants, workers, Dalits, Adivasis, and religious, ethnic, and sexual minorities. So we have seen a weakening of federal polity and in fact weakening of democracy itself in the recent years in India. In the way, for example, the government at the center, the attitude that it had towards a profound crisis that the people of Kerala had been facing, and the way they took it so lightly and were very unsympathetic when even other countries came to, they were ready to come to our rescue. So all these show a kind of distancing of the periphery from the center, of the states from the central government, and a crisis of federalism itself. And we have witnessed several instances where the state has exceeded its mandate in order to suppress popular dissent or to protect corporate interests by diluting environmental safeguards, as done both by the last governments did this dilution of the environmental safeguards, which has contributed a lot to many natural disasters, including the floods that we witnessed. So I'm not putting the whole blame on the central government. Of course, everyone had to be cautious about the environment and the environmental safeguards. But these rules remain on the page, but they are seldom practiced in actual real politics or real life. Or the justification and the trivialization of genocides as spontaneous emotional reactions, like the Sikh riots or the Gujarat pogrom and the engineered communal riots in various parts of India. So at the present moment, the biggest challenge, I think, to our democracy and perhaps the very integrity of our social fabric is political Hindutva. So in some sense, I am speaking also of the post-deluge situation in Kerala, to which many people referred. So instead of rebuilding our lives, now, unfortunately, we have been dragged into an agenda that has been set by somebody else. Like the issue of the pilgrimage to Shabarimala. I am not denying the gender dimension of that issue, which I consider extremely important. But this is not the time when such an issue should have taken the central place in our debates and arguments. But it is a time when we should have devoted all our energies to the rebuilding of Kerala in every sense. So political Hindutva, despite its false claims to patriotism, is a colonial construct, borrowing elements from Western Orientalism, the Judaic idea of religion, and the fascist ideas of cultural nationalism, as manifested at various times in Germany, Spain, and Italy, whose murderous intent has been expressed many a time in recent history, from Gandhi's assassination to the destruction of the Babri Masjid, the Gujarat pogrom, several bomb blasts and manufactured riots, the silencing and murder of dissenting writers and intellectuals, isolation and even lynching of those belonging to minorities, persecution of tribal peoples and Dalits, and the taking over and ruination of public institutions, selective action based on false accusations against non-governmental organizations, destructive interventions in autonomous bodies, including universities, ban on everything from beef to books and labor strikes, calculated censorships, labeling of every dissenter as a traitor worthy of sedition charges, the shameless promotion of chosen corporate houses through loan waivers, subsidies, and tax exemptions, and the brutal and blinding attacks on common people, including children, as we recently witnessed even like in Kashmir. So political Hindutva finds the diversity of India as unwelcome and a disturbing presence. And Kerala perhaps is the best example of the kind of diversity of our people, because we have people belonging to all religions. It is true we don't have many Buddhists and Jains anymore, but we have a tradition which is very much reflected in our culture and literature of Jainism and Buddhism, and we have people who belong to all the different religions. So we have people from different ethnicities, different religions, and there are people who speak different languages, even though Malayalam is supposed to be the language of Kerala. A recent unofficial survey by Ganesh Devi has shown how each of our states has sometimes 30 or 40 languages, even though we often do not take them into account. So in that sense, Kerala is a very good example to the diversity, in every sense, the diversity of culture, language, ethnicity, and religion that defines the whole of the nation. So it is this pluralist ethos that is very much under attack now. Because we have a system, a ruling system that does not believe anymore in dialogue, exchange, and debate. And of course, we see that in the social media every day. And when I speak of social media, I also realize very much that how social media were put into very active and positive use during the floods. I mean, how the Facebook and the various kinds of cyber media about which many were cynical. Not perhaps me, but many of my generation were cynical, suddenly found that all these were being put to very positive use during the floods to reach the people who were isolated or caught in trapped in isolated areas. At the same time, we also need to be extremely cautious about the social media, which are also used to promote what can be called authoritarian populism, which believes in the monologue of power, which avoids any kind of honest conversation and confrontation with the press or with the people, and oversimplify things and see everything in black and white without any kind of nuance and subtle thinking. So, and also rewriting history, turning its protagonists and writing off the people, turning itself into its protagonists and writing off the people and events that they dislike, viewing honest history as conspiratorial and attacking the most credible of historians and their works. These are some of the authoritarian strategies for colonizing the minds of the people. And the state becomes an occupant. It occupies, like the colonizer, various kinds of institutions as part of its authoritarian game. It is noteworthy that these attitudes and strategies are very close to what has been called universal fascism by a thinker like Umberto Eco. Because it is characterized by the cult of tradition that considers truth as already revealed as or known, that goes against the grain of scientific thinking, portraying dissent as betrayal, fearing difference, defining the nation in negative and exclusivist ways, leading to xenophobia and a creation of the other who is always wrong, appealing to the frustrated middle classes who are scared of the struggles and successes of the lower classes and are led to believe in the vision of a past golden age that they can restore by aligning themselves with the fascist forces, and the identification of the voice of one small group with the voice of the whole people, scorn for the weak and the disadvantaged, based on a machismo that has a suspicion of intellectuals and of progressive thought in general. So in fact, it is in this context that we have now across Kerala discussions and debates on Kerala's renaissance, its inclusive nature, the kind of values that Kerala's renaissance tried to uphold, the values of amity, the values of equality, the values of religious brotherhood, and humanism, even if a spiritual kind of humanism like the one upheld by Sri Narayana Guru, or the belief in the most oppressed sections of the people whose champions like Ayyankali were in the forefront of Renaissance, and also of the other minority communities. We had various leaders from the Muslim and Christian communities. So we have like Poigal Appachan or Makti Tangal, quite a few. I'm not going into the names. So it is important today to retrieve, not only to retrieve the values of Renaissance, but also to see it a bit critically for some of its silences. For example, when you look at its gender aspect, I think there is a lot to be criticized. We see that the gender issue had not been properly addressed, and the woman was trained only to be a good wife, and not necessarily someone who can work, who can be independent, and who can be assertive. So and similarly, the role of the minorities was very often overlooked by most of the historians of Kerala's Renaissance. So we need not just to bring back the values of Renaissance, but also to look at it critically and fill the gaps and the silences that Kerala's Renaissance had perhaps left. And as part of it, we also need to look at the concept of nationalism. I'm not going into the details. I would only say that perhaps we need to read Tagore again and his critique of nationalism and its pathology. How nations are invented where no nation existed, and how they are sustained through continuous propaganda and a whole system of rituals and symbols, and often leads to what can be called a cultural nationalism, which is advocated and practiced by the spokesmen of Hindutva, pitching its tent precisely on those premises. So what it promotes is what I would call a kind of exclusive nationalism, where some people are considered foreign because they belong to certain particular religions or have their origins outside India, or they do not follow the so-called Hindu customs. I'm not going into the making of the Hindutva, which is itself another long project that has been going on since the founding of the Hindu Mahasabha. So they have created a monstrously exclusive idea of Hinduism itself, as their idea of Hinduism carefully keeps out all the non-theistic and materialist traditions of thought native to India, like Sankhya and Charvaka, and even the internal critiques of religion developed within India by, for example, the Bhakti poets from Tirumular to Kabir to Elthachan to Gandhi to Sri Narayana Guru, and of course B.R. Ambedkar. So the critique, all these critiques are in no way taken into account in the construction of this idea of Hindutva. And the limits of this exclusion can be widened, as its practitioners can anytime have it expanded. It can include non-caste Hindus, non-believers, secularists, Marxists, and all those who interrogate the legitimacy of their kind of nationalism, as the misuses of the law of sedition in the recent years clearly show. So we need today to de-transcendentalize the nation and reappropriate it for the people, so that people can imagine the nation and relate to it in their own different ways through the mediation of their own languages and their own cultures. Then maybe no idea of nationalism will be able to throttle democracy. But as soon as one section begins to impose its exclusivist idea of the nation on others and labels those who imagine the nation differently as traitors, it becomes anti-democratic. And that is the situation through which we are now passing. So to emphasize and even to celebrate our creative diversity is the only way to combat the standardization of Indian culture sought by the divisive Hindutva ideologues. As it has been said here many times, Kerala has been a great example of co-living, religious coexistence particularly, and we are afraid now that gaps and fissures have begun to appear in Kerala's community as the result of a very deliberate plan to divide the people, to create schisms even within families around issues like the issue of the entry of women into Shabarimala. So it becomes extremely important to emphasize this tradition of religious amity and cooperation and co-living. So this kind of insular nationalism can be countered only by, which is actually a kind of unholy alliance between crony capitalism and majoritarian communalism, can be countered only by building a democratic subaltern counter nationalism based on justice, freedom, and equality that can very well accept an egalitarian internationalism based on the principles of sovereignty of nations, equality, promotion of world peace, decentralization, each nation's freedom to choose its path of development, basic human rights and dignity, ecological caution, cultural pluralism, respect for difference, decolonization, and a vision of the world as a creative space rather than a market, and dialogue and epistemic exchange, and absence of the division of the nations as central and peripheral. And Kerala can very well set, I believe, a kind of model, because we have moved halfway towards this idea of nationhood. We have shown a great example through our democratic practices, through our tradition of dialogue and exchange and of coexistence and the sustenance of cultural, especially cultural diversity. And I also believe, I would just be fast. I also believe that we need to rethink the idea of the secular. I will not read any part of the paper. I will just say that generally the idea of secularism that we follow is something borrowed from the West, from John Holyoake and Charles Perrow and all those people. Which believes in the dissociation of the state from the religion, and equal justice to people of all religions, which is absolutely all right. But what we forget very often is that this idea was developed in mono-religious nations. And while it comes to a multi-religious nation like India, I believe it also needs to include another understanding of secularism within the civil society. About the state, well, the Western model is all right. But when we come to civil society, we need to look at secularism also as a space where various religions and non-religious ideologies can absolutely coexist. And the best example of that would be Gandhi's own idea of Sarva Dharma Sahabhav, treating all religions as equal and developing the amity between religious groups and non-religious intellectuals and non-religious public. Because by avoiding this question, by not addressing the question of religion, I believe we have left religion entirely, religion and the past and all the traditions and cultures and arts that go with it, to the enemy, to those who want to appropriate all these for their own political cause and political agenda. Remember in Kerala, the secular and progressive ideas actually grew through independent cultural spaces, including religious cultural spaces. I remember in my own childhood how we listened to the Katha Prasangam of Sambashivan or Kadamangalam Satchidanandan, who introduced very progressive stories, taken from the world literature or Malayalam literature, and progressive plays like Ningal in a communist, like you made me a communist, were staged in the temple premises. What happened to that in the last 10 or 15 years? Now you find that space has been completely appropriated by the Hindutva forces, and you find only religious discourses there. You hear speeches about religion, and religion especially interpreted in a particular extremely insular kind of fashion, or only certain traditional art forms being performed. So the culture of interrogation, which had found a space even in our temple premises, that has disappeared along with the space itself, which has been appropriated by these forces who reinforce divisive practices. And so we need also to understand the struggles within idealism. I mean, when we make a clean division between idealism and materialism, we also need to see that within for example, the theologies of liberation, or the Bhakti tradition, or the Sufi tradition, various kinds of Ayya Vaikuntha, or Narayana Guru, or Poigila Pachan, and Abraham Alpan, Moidu Malui, Mark Titangal. A lot of people who tried to create secular spaces within religion. They did not denounce religion, they did not denounce spirituality and idealism, but they used used it to reinforce the amity among religions rather than to create hatred, as it is often being done today. So I think we need to have a second look at this clean binary of materialism and idealism, and also look at the battles that have happened within what has been called idealism in order to develop an idea of a freedom and liberation of the society and culture in general. So, and secularism again in India cannot ignore institutions like a caste, because whenever we speak of secularism, we speak of religions only. But then I believe in India, when we speak of secularism, we also need to take into account the caste, because today, for example, one can belong to a caste and be even a member of a caste association and still claim that he or she is a secular. So, and it is also wrong to imagine that caste will be automatically abolished if religions are abolished. Anyway, religions are not going to be abolished. Let us not have any illusions about that. And it is not unlike believing that economic equality will end patriarchy. I mean, you will need specific struggle for gender liberation, and you will need specific struggles for the liberation of the Dalits, specific struggles for the minorities, even if economic equality is achieved. That is what the history of the last 50 years, the history of socialism particularly, has taught us. So the annihilation of caste has to be one of the first priorities of any secular agenda, because caste is economic, caste is cultural, it has a self-perpetuating psychology, it is a spatial ideology, as a distance is involved in that. It's also a linguistic ideology, as there are various community speeches which distance one community from the other. And so we need to look at caste from different points of view and put annihilation of caste as one of the major items on the secular agenda. And I will end just saying that we also need to develop an aesthetics of resistance. Of course, that is my special area, but I'm not going deep into that. But I would only say that even in situations like this, art can be of immense use in many ways. One, of course, you have the examples of crafts being used, like now there is going to be a talk on Chekuti, the doll. So crafts and arts can be used in very, very creative ways to bring people together, and also to create an economic base for the destitute. But more than that, art and literature can also be used as major sites of resistance, which does not mean that art should be strictly, ideological, because resistance in art cannot be mechanically equated with the resistance of the people. But it works in relation to that by discovering aesthetic and emotional structures and creating new languages of the avant-garde writing and avant-garde art. So commitment is not just a question of producing works, but also a question of that is a new dimension we have to take into account. It's a question of radical ways of reading and appreciation of works, not merely at the level of theme and content, but also that of form. We need to take into account also the language, the form when we discuss literature or other kinds of art. And just because somebody declares that he or she is committed does not mean that the art itself is committed. This is, of course, an old question which Marx and Engels had tackled, and recently with the emergence of the theories of reading, we know that the way you read a work also plays an important role in the meanings that they generate. So the ideology of reading becomes as important as the ideology of writing. And there is a literature of resistance coming up from especially the tribal literature, Dalit literature, women's literature. These are some of the major forms of literature which have gained strength during the last 1 or 2 decades across Indian languages, and they have created their own aesthetics, which is perhaps a little different from the conventional aesthetic that we are familiar with. So we need an inclusive approach to art that can be developed only through developing ways of counter reading and deconstructive practices. So because works of literature are polyphonic, they have many voices, and you can hear one voice or the other. I am coming here from another seminar which I myself had chiefly organized on Mahabharata, where there were various kinds of readings of Mahabharata, where including Krishna, including Bhagavad Gita, everything was questioned. There, nothing was considered sacred, and there were, readings from the angles of the persecuted and marginalized women, of the marginalized characters, and people of different castes and tribes. And so it is possible that all these epics and the traditional literature can be reappropriated for the people if we can read them from the point of view of the people. So it becomes important, and reading that way becomes important. Well, I will not go into, again, I have examples from painting, from sculpture, from film, from theater. Theater, again, is something, especially street plays, and then documentaries and films, which are two of the most popular forms of art, can be put to great use in creating this kind of an awareness about and awareness also about the kind of new Kerala that we are all speaking about. What that new Kerala should be can well be taught to the people or brought to the people through, say, forms like street plays. I have always wondered why in the 70s we had street plays and suddenly they have disappeared. And I think this is the time when we should have such very vibrant forms of theater and vibrant forms of art which can talk to people directly and create a self-awareness within oneself and within the whole society itself, and create tools of the criticism of the status quo and the material and the cultural violence that it perpetrates. So it is the undeclared, I'll close here, it is the undeclared mission of art today to retrieve the past without being atavistic, to disentangle the effects of power from representations, to re-establish the almost lost connections between man and nature, to redefine the boundaries between the self and the other, and the self and nature in the context of man's species arrogance that cripples the environment as well as his own moral and spiritual life, to resensitize man to suffering, alienation, and solitude, and to give positive non-violence and love, which is its greatest expression, the central place it ought to have in all human discourse. I'll just conclude by quoting Walter Benjamin. Even the dead will not be safe from the enemy if he wins, and this enemy has not ceased to be victorious.